Hi YouTube, and Happy New Year to everyone. We're back with another Sony A7RV video, and in this one I'm going to talk you through my first couple of paid job experiences with the camera and show you some images, talk you through some stuff about how I found it, and give you a little bit about the future plans. So back in middle of December, I think it was, I had my first wedding where I was able to use this camera. It was only a half-day booking for me and meant to only be from ceremony through to call for dinner, but I ended up turning up a little bit early, try to get some bridal prep shots just to see what the camera would be like, particularly in more challenging lighting conditions. As I talk through here, I'm going to throw up some of the images from the day. I would also want to say that I was only using the medium raw. That'll be my plan with this camera for probably 95% of the photos that I take. If you want to know why, see my other video. So the wedding was out at Logie Country House, which is a lovely venue. Unfortunately, it was quite a dull day, middle of December. It was raining and cloudy in the morning when I got there. And the lighting inside was just, it was really, really limited, both in the house where Gemma, our bride, was getting ready, but also over in the ballroom where the ceremony was going to be. There was just really next to no light at all. It was so poor lighting that I decided I needed to use flash for pretty much all of the day, which I really love the photos and how they've came out, but it did mean that my testing of the camera was a little bit limited because obviously I didn't need to put my ISO as high as it typically could be challenged on a wedding day where you've got a little bit more natural light that you can use. There were a couple of shots that I ended up turning the flash off, just some detail shots and things like that, so we weren't able to really test out the high ISO performance at this wedding. What we were able to see was how the dynamic range coped with this camera. I'll talk a little bit more about what I found with the dynamic range and how I used it in editing at the second half of this video, where I'll get some of the raw images up on screen and show you what you can do with them. In terms of the camera itself, it performed really well, very similar to the A7 IV, which is what I've been using in the past and had on my other body with a longer lens. I stuck with the Samyang 24mm f1.8 lens all day for the A7RV, and that allowed me to punch into APS-C mode as and when I needed to give me that sort of 24 and 35mm combo. One thing I have noticed about the A7RV that I'm not a huge fan of is the shutter noise of the camera. It's actually quite quiet, but it sounds so pathetic and it sounds like the camera's gonna fall to pieces. I don't know if you'll be able to hear this, but I'll try and fire off a couple of photos and hold it up to the microphone and see if you can hear. And then compared to the A7 IV, it's what I've typically been used to over the last couple of years. And I don't know, to me, the A7 IV's shutter just sounds a little bit more robust, would be the word I would probably use. But I think that's very minor, and it's something I'll get used to over time. And at the very end of the year, I also had a pre-wedding shoot with my boss, funnily enough, who's getting married later this year, who I'll be doing her photos for her wedding. And we went out towards Braemar, Invercald Estate. Lovely scenery there, and again, took the 24mm with me here. We were going to a waterfall and I didn't want to carry too much kit, so I had the two cameras, 24mm and the 85 on the A7 IV. Again, just fire through a few of the images here. Not too much to learn from these photos, I don't think, because decent enough light throughout the day. Let's jump over and take a look at some of the raw images, and you'll be able to see some sharpness examples and some noise examples as well. Okay, so looking at predominantly the dynamic range here, I've picked out a few images where I think there was something I could say about each one from that December wedding. So this is the inside of the ballroom at Logie, and this was one of the ones that I did turn the flash off for, but to do that I've had to drop the shutter to 1/50th, ISO 1000 and f2.2 on the Samyang 24mm. So if you know your stuff about photography, that you can work out that must have been quite a dark environment with this sort of exposure at those settings. So one thing I was a little bit worried about whenever I dropped the shutter to something like 1/50th or below, anything below 1/200th than I normally get, a little bit worried about camera shake. But I probably would have focused, I can't remember exactly where I focused, but I probably would have focused somewhere about midway through the frame at f2.2 to try and get as much depth of field as I could. And you can see here when I zoom in to 100% that this box here looks really sharp to me. The chairs are slightly out of focus rather than any camera shake, but probably not enough that you're going, maybe I focused a little bit further back, because that looks a wee bit sharper than those flowers. But certainly we've got no camera shake there at 1/50th, which was great. Moving on to getting some detail shots inside there now, and this was one where using the flash, I sort of thought, probably a bit overexposed, but it would be a good one to see how much can we take those, either the highlights back or drop the exposure. So in post, if you bring the highlights all the way down, you're maybe looking at something that is a little bit better, but I would probably, for this, I would get the exposure somewhere that I'm happier with first, and then adjust the highlights to taste, maybe something like that. So what's that? 0.7 of a stop down, and zooming in to 100% again, you can see really good sharpness, really good image quality, and yeah, no issues whatsoever with that. And that's something that I might have expected my A7 IV to be able to do, but I would have had reservations at anything more than half a stop, and I think I might have been a little bit worried about how much dynamic range this camera would be able to cope with. Moving into doing some bridal prep shots just towards the tail end, a bit of a mess inside the room as can be expected, but this was a good example of where I try not to use flash wherever I can, because what happened here was I took this photo, had a quick check of it, realized it was way overexposed because of the flash, and then tried to get another one by changing the settings. I've probably closed the aperture down. What were we, f2, and then I'm at f2.8 with this next one, which is much closer to what I would want my exposure to be out of camera, but it's not a great face on Gemma here because she's mid-blink. It's not a brilliant photo by any stretch, but it's just a simple one for this sort of test. So when I got back into editing these photos, this was the only one that I was quite happy with the facial expression, but then the exposure is way off, and this is probably at its limit here. So the first thing I would do in post with this sort of shot is try to bring the exposure down, but you'll see here mainly on her chest and her shoulder, as I start to go down, and this would be too far for my taste, but just to show the point, we're really starting to lose that highlight detail here on her chest and her shoulder. So the best I would probably go to for the exposure is maybe somewhere around there, which is maybe 1.2, between 1 and 1.2 down on the exposure. I'll try maybe closer to 1 and then see what I can do with the highlights and maybe the whites. And bringing the highlights down, again, at about 65, we're starting to lose that chest and shoulder detail there. So I would maybe go to about 44 on the highlights. Whites, I don't think that's going to help us much either, no. But that, I would probably say, is usable without it being fantastic. Maybe if I warmed it up a wee bit, it might hide some of that shoulder detail as well. So that's what one stop on the exposure down and minus 44 on the highlights. So quite a bit of saving there, if you like, from a shot that started off way overexposed and looked like it had been completely lost. Gemma then went over to the window with the makeup artist here and getting her final touch-ups, and I thought, okay, let's try switching the flash off and see if we can get a more moody sort of shot here. So I was going for a dark sort of exposure, and we'd have needed to warm this up quite a bit. Again, this is one thing I don't like about these mixed lighting conditions, is you're then going to be really warming up the background light if you're using natural light here. But I probably would have put my white balance to something like that. But what I thought this would be an interesting shot to show is two things. One, that's me at the 24mm, tucked right into the corner here, and I'm getting that wide shot that has the context of the room that they're in. Whereas the next shot, I just simply clicked my button to punch into APS-C mode, and that's me getting that sort of 36mm equivalent. So it just gives you a very quick, different frame that is maybe more of a portrait over a environmental sort of portrait shot. And that, to me, is so quick and so handy, and to have the same resolution on both, what are we, 6240 by 4160, 6240 by 4160. So you're getting the same resolution in APS-C as you are in full frame. And the other thing that I thought this might have been useful to show is if you were wanting to then raise the shadows, what happens to the noise level in the shadows. So we're at 640 on the ISO. If I zoom in here, it looks pretty standard to me. There is some noise there, but we are in the shadow areas, and let's just bring those shadows up. So maybe you would want something that's a little bit more of an even exposure on your shot, a little bit higher on the exposure as well, and bring that highlights down a wee bit. So if for whatever reason in editing you were deciding to edit this way, what would that do? And again, you're seeing some noise here, but it's not what I would say noticeable. And I don't know if this will help either, but if we go full size on that, and you're just looking at that image, ignoring the sort of colors, because I don't think that's color balanced well at all, but looking more at the potential noise there, I don't think you look at that and say, oh, that's a noisy image at all. And I've lifted the shadows almost all the way up. So as I was saying, I'm very impressed by the dynamic range that I'm getting off this camera. The next few are pretty much just examples of ones where, again, exposure changes were needed in post. So a little bit unusual, this wedding, they did the cake cut at the end of the ceremony. So we just moved over, and with this, I deliberately, there was a fire exit over at the right hand side here, but with this one I would have deliberately just cropped in a wee bit to get rid of that in the corner. And then the cake for me is a little bit too bright here, so again, probably go down with the exposure a wee bit first. I don't want to go too far though with that, because I think Gemma and Dan are quite well exposed there, and bring the highlights down a wee bit, and that's a much more pleasant exposure for me on the cake. So again, 640 on the ISO there, and this was with flash, so you can see what you're getting there. And the building itself, Logie House, not much to show on this shot because sun's quite low in the sky. This was in the afternoon after the rain had stopped. So what was that, 3:18, came out to get a nicer shot of the venue with the sun hitting it. But all I was looking at with this was what happens if you bring the highlights completely down. And it's not that much, to be fair. I don't know if there was just a lack of colour in the sky, but we've got a wee bit of blue there, but we're not getting, I don't think that looks too good in terms of lowering those highlights and then raising the shadows and zooming in. Again, looks absolutely fine to my eye. No issues whatsoever with that. I wouldn't edit that way, but again, just showing you what sort of range you're getting. The penultimate one, I'll just show you this quickly. It was similar to one of those ones at the start, but again, with this, we can go, 1.4 down on the exposure. Coming in, we haven't really degraded the image at all, so I'd be really happy with that. Again, probably wouldn't go all that way down, but just shows you the range you can get. And then one last one of Gemma and Dan together. I think in post I probably cropped this into more of a square to get rid of that sort of square, the chairs and the sockets. And this shot, I did it quite dark in my edit, but we've got them lit with a flash behind them here. And I just thought this might be interesting to look at in terms of if you did want to raise the exposure. So if I put that back to, where's my crop? Here we go. If I put that back to what it was, what happens in those deep shadow areas if I did underexpose a photo and had to lift up the shadows and the exposure quite a bit. And I'm probably more interested, obviously we've got the flaring of the lens here, but I'm maybe more interested in what we've got over in the corners and these sort of areas where you've got more shadow, clean shadows if you like, rather than a flare shadow. So over here, wee bit of noise, nothing I would say is distracting in terms of the look of the whole image. So yeah, and again, one stop, we've pushed that up, and 61 on the shadows. So again, this one though, only ISO 200 with me wanting that darker exposure straight out of camera. But for me, really, really impressed. So overall, I've been very, very impressed by the A7RV from these two shoots. Still am interested to see what it's like when I'm maybe natural light only and around 2500 ISO, 3200 and around that sort of ISO range, and then having to pull the shadows and drop the highlights. That'll be quite interesting to see for weddings coming up. So I will do another video like this where I'm not using flash and in more challenging lighting conditions. Once wedding season kicks in. So if you'd like to keep up with my A7R5 progress, as I said in the last one, you know what to do. Give me a like on this video and consider subscribing. That'll let me know that you'd be interested to see more. Thanks for watching.